harness that would hold the compression pad in place, over the wound, under the thigh, over again, under again, forming a web of tension that distributed the holding force. Then came the crucial part. He took the broken tent pole, about 18 inches of aluminum tubing that had snapped clean in the middle, and he threaded it through the loops formed by the rifle slings, positioning it perpendicular to the leg so it could function as a windlass, as a rotational lever that would let him apply tremendous pressure by simply twisting. Reyes began turning the pole, slowly at first, watching the slings tighten, watching the laundry bag compress, watching the wound, and he could see the blood flow beginning to slow as the pressure increased, could see the bright arterial spurts becoming weaker, becoming pulses instead of sprays, and he kept twisting, kept increasing the pressure until the blood flow stopped completely, until the compression was so tight he could barely turn the pole another degree, and then he locked it in place by tying off the pole with the canteen strap, creating a friction lock that would prevent the windlass from unwinding. The device looked absurd, a mud-covered laundry bag wrapped around a soldier's thigh, held in place by rifle slings and a tent pole, the whole assembly crude and improvised and nothing like the clean medical equipment from training. But when Reyes checked the wound, he found something miraculous. The bleeding had stopped, completely stopped, the arterial spray reduced to nothing, and when he checked Collins's pulse distal to the wound he could feel it, weak but present, meaning he hadn't cut off circulation entirely, hadn't created a situation where saving the blood meant losing the leg. But Collins was still screaming, still thrashing, because without morphine there was no relief from the pain of having shrapnel-torn flesh compressed under windlass pressure, and Reyes had to hold him down, had to use his body to pin Collins's shoulders while the soldier fought against consciousness and pain and shock. German mortar fire was still falling, shells impacting close enough that Reyes could feel the pressure waves, could feel hot metal fragments whizzing past his head, and the lieutenant was yelling for the platoon to fall back, to retreat to better positions before the Germans zeroed in on their location. But Reyes knew he couldn't move Collins yet, couldn't risk disrupting the improvised compression device until he was certain it would hold, couldn't abandon his patient even though staying meant being exposed to fire that was getting more accurate with each salvo. Reyes made the decision that would either save them both or kill them both. He was going to drag Collins to cover while maintaining the pressure device, which meant crawling backward across 30 feet of open ground while supporting a wounded soldier's weight and keeping his hands on the laundry bag compression pad to ensure it didn't shift. He hooked his arms under Collins's shoulders, planted his boots in the mud, and began pulling, moving inch by inch while mortar fragments pinged off the rocks around them, while Collins screamed with every jarring movement, while Reyes's own muscles burned from the effort of dragging 180 pounds of dead weight across rocky terrain. Mud, blood, and smoke filled the air until Reyes couldn't tell what was artillery fog and what was his own sweat running into his eyes. Couldn't tell if the wetness on his hands was Collins's blood or his own from where the rifle slings had cut into his palms. Couldn't tell anything except that he had to keep moving, had to keep pulling, had to get to cover before a shell landed in exactly the wrong place. They made it to a collapsed stone wall that provided minimal protection, and Reyes collapsed beside Collins, gasping, checking the improvised device with shaking hands, and finding that somehow, impossibly, it had held, the compression was still in place, the blood flow was still stopped, the windlass hadn't slipped even through all that movement and chaos. For 40 minutes they stayed in that position. Reyes crouched beside Collins, one hand always on the laundry bag device to monitor it, to make micro-adjustments as needed, to ensure the pressure stayed in the sweet spot between too much crushing force and not enough compression. While the battle raged around them, while the platoon fell back in stages, while German artillery tried to destroy positions that Americans had already abandoned, while the fog thickened and visibility dropped to almost nothing, Collins stopped screaming after 20 minutes, not because the pain decreased but because his body simply ran out of the energy to scream, shock taking him into a gray zone between consciousness and unconsciousness where he just moaned continuously and shook with tremors that Reyes recognized as early hypovolemic shock despite the stopped bleeding. Reyes talked to him the whole time, not saying anything meaningful, just maintaining a stream of words that would keep Collins anchored to consciousness. "Stay with me, Collins, you're doing great. The bleeding stopped. Help is coming. Just stay awake. Keep breathing. You're going to see your family again. You're going to walk out of these mountains. Just stay with me." It was a lie. Reyes had no idea if help was coming, had no idea if the combat engineer squad could reach them through the German fire, had no idea if any of them would survive the next hour. But it was a necessary lie, the kind medics tell because hope is sometimes the only medicine left. When the combat engineer squad finally reached them, emerging from the fog like ghosts in olive-drab uniforms. Their sergeant took one look at Collins's leg and stared in disbelief at the improvised contraption holding everything together. The laundry bag black with blood, the rifle sling stretched tight, the tent pole windlass locked in place with a canteen strap, the whole assembly looking like something from a fever dream rather than battlefield medicine. "What the hell is that?" the engineer sergeant asked, and Reyes was too exhausted to explain properly, just muttered something about pressure compression and improvised windlass and keeping arterial flow stopped without crushing the nerve, and the engineer looked at him like he was speaking another language but then carefully helped lift Collins onto a stretcher without disrupting Reyes's device because whatever it was clearly working, and in combat you don't question success, you just preserve it and move forward. The evacuation took another 2 hours, carrying Collins down the mountain on improvised stretcher routes, through terrain so rough that normal litter-bearer techniques didn't work, across ground still under sporadic German fire, and Reyes stayed with him the entire time, one hand always monitoring the laundry bag compression, making adjustments when the pressure seemed to loosen, tightening the windlass another degree when he felt blood beginning to seep through, refusing to hand Collins off to anyone else because he was the only one who understood how the improvised device worked, the only one who could maintain it properly. At the aid station 6 miles behind the lines, a surgeon named Captain Williams took one look at the leg and at Reyes's compression contraption and didn't say anything at first, just carefully examined the wound, checked for pulse and capillary refill distal to the device, tested nerve response, and then stood up and looked at Reyes with an expression somewhere between respect and disbelief. "Son," Williams said slowly, "I've been doing battlefield surgery for 2 years and I've seen a lot of improvised medical care, but whatever you built out there, it worked better than half the gear we've got in this aid station. The arterial bleed is completely controlled. There's no compartment syndrome, the nerve appears intact, and you did all this with a laundry bag and tent pole." Reyes nodded, too tired to feel pride, just feeling the overwhelming relief that Collins would probably live, would probably keep his leg, would probably walk again once the surgeons repaired the artery and the torn muscle. Williams turned to his assistant and said something Reyes would remember for the rest of his life. "Document this technique. Get photographs. Write down exactly how he built it. Because if this kid figured out how to stop a femoral arterial bleed with garbage and physics, then we need to teach it to every medic in the theater." But they never did, not officially anyway, because medical doctrine doesn't change easily, because improvised techniques don't fit into standardized training, because the Army Medical Corps had procedures and equipment and protocols that left no room for laundry bags and tent poles even when those improvised tools worked better than standard issue gear. But the knowledge spread anyway, carried through the informal networks that keep soldiers alive, the conversations in aid stations, the stories told in foxholes, the quiet demonstrations that medics gave each other when they had a few minutes behind the lines. Reyes's laundry bag compression sling became a legend in the Italian mountains, a technique passed from medic to medic through whispered instructions and hand-drawn diagrams, a solution for that worst-case scenario when you had an arterial bleed and no morphine and no proper pressure bandages and only seconds to save a life. Some medics carried laundry bags in their gear specifically because they'd heard the story and wanted to be ready if they ever faced the same impossible situation. Others modified the technique using different materials, parachute silk instead of laundry bag fabric, pistol belts instead of rifle slings, but keeping the core principle of distributed pressure applied through a windlass mechanism. The Army never officially documented it, never added it to training manuals, never issued laundry bags as part of the standard medic kit, but soldiers knew, medics knew, and in the mountains of Italy and later in France and Germany, when morphine ran out and supplies were exhausted and a soldier was bleeding to death from an arterial wound, there was sometimes a medic who remembered hearing about Sergeant Tom Reyes and his desperate improvisation on a rocky ridge, and that medic would grab whatever materials were available, a bag, some straps, a pole, and build a pressure device that no manual described but that physics supported and that desperation made necessary. Reyes himself survived the war, came home to New Mexico, became a school teacher, and rarely talked about his time as a medic, but on the rare occasions when he did, he would always say the same thing. The difference between life and death on a battlefield isn't always about having the right equipment. Sometimes it's about understanding the principles well enough to build the right equipment from whatever you've got, being desperate enough to try something completely new, and being lucky enough that your wild improvisation actually works. He died in 1987 at age 70, and his obituary mentioned he was a decorated combat medic but gave no details about the laundry bag, the tent pole, the rifle slings, or the soldier whose life he saved with an invention no manual had ever described. But in the communities of combat medics, in the informal histories passed down through generations of military medical personnel, the story of Tom Reyes and his compression sling remains a testament to the idea that sometimes the most effective medicine isn't in the kit, it's in the improvisation, the creativity, the refusal to accept that out of supplies means out of options, and the desperate ingenuity that emerges when a medic looks at a laundry bag and sees not a receptacle for dirty socks but a tool that could save a life. The morphine was gone, the tourniquets were slipping in the freezing mud, and the wounded soldier had less than a minute before he bled out. So Sergeant Tom Reyes grabbed a laundry bag, 2 rifle slings, and a snapped tent pole, and invented a pressure device no medic manual had ever seen. Though this moment of desperate improvisation began hours earlier in the Apennine Mountains of Italy in 1943 during some of the most brutal fighting of the Italian campaign, where a small American infantry platoon found themselves pinned down by German mortar fire on a rocky ridge so steep and muddy that evacuation was impossible, where the terrain consisted of shattered pine trees and frozen mud that turned to slush under artillery fire, where fog rolled through the valleys carrying the sound of distant screams and the metallic ring of shrapnel hitting helmets, and where Sergeant Tom Reyes, 26 years old, a field medic known among his unit for improvising solutions under fire, carried a standard medic kit that was nearly empty after 3 days of nonstop combat, his supplies depleted to almost nothing, his morphine syrettes down to the last one which he'd used an hour ago on a soldier with a sucking chest wound, his pressure bandages gone, his sulfa powder exhausted, leaving him with essentially nothing but gauze, tape, and the desperate knowledge that when the next casualty happened he'd have almost no tools to save them. Reyes was exhausted beyond anything he'd experienced before. Dehydrated, covered in mud and blood that wasn't all his own. His hands shaking from adrenaline and cold, his mind operating on that razor edge between clarity and collapse that comes from 72 hours without real sleep. When the mortar shell exploded 30 feet from their position with a concussive blast that threw dirt and rock into the air, and when the debris settled he heard the screaming, heard Private Daniel Collins yelling for a medic, and Reyes was moving before conscious thought, crawling across exposed ground while German machine gun fire chewed up the rocks around him, reaching Collins to find the worst thing a medic can see. A massive arterial bleed from the femoral artery in the thigh where shrapnel had torn through muscle and severed the main blood vessel, bright red blood spraying in rhythmic pulses that matched the soldier's heartbeat, each pulse sending more of Collins's blood volume into the Italian mud, and Reyes knew immediately that this soldier had maybe 60 seconds before hypovolemic shock took him, maybe 2 minutes before he bled out completely, and there was no time for careful assessment, no time for textbook procedures, just time for the desperate application of whatever might work. Reyes's hands moved automatically, pulling his last tourniquet from his kit, a simple strap device that worked by compression, and wrapping it high on Collins's thigh, cinching it tight, twisting the windlass to apply pressure, but immediately he saw the problem. The wound angle was wrong. The tourniquet couldn't get proper compression because of how the shrapnel had torn the flesh. The slippery mud and blood made everything slide, and Collins was thrashing violently from pain and shock, his body convulsing in ways that prevented the tourniquet from staying in the optimal position, and worst of all, worse than anything, Reyes had no morphine left to calm him, no way to reduce the shock and pain that were making Collins fight against the very treatment trying to save him. The lieutenant was shouting from cover 20 feet away, his voice barely audible over the artillery. "Reyes, do something. He's not going to make it." And Reyes felt the panic rising in his chest, felt the terrible weight of watching someone die because you don't have the right equipment, because 3 days of casualties have stripped you of every tool, because the supply situation is so bad that medics are operating with gear meant for a 6-hour battle stretched across 72 hours of continuous fighting. Collins was screaming. Not words, just the raw animal sound of someone experiencing pain beyond what the human mind can process. And his blood was pooling in the mud despite the tourniquet, and Reyes realized with sick certainty that the standard approach wasn't working, that this soldier would die in the next 30 seconds if something didn't change, and in that moment of desperation his mind shifted from following procedures to improvising solutions, shifted from being a medic who applied standard treatments to being a mechanic who needed to build something from whatever parts were available. Reyes tore through his gear with mud-slicked hands, dumping the contents of his medic bag into the dirt, searching for anything useful and finding almost nothing. A few gauze pads that wouldn't stop this kind of bleeding, tape that wouldn't adhere to blood-soaked skin, scissors, an empty morphine box that mocked him with its uselessness. But then his hands found other things, things that weren't medical supplies but were just gear, just the random equipment that every soldier carried. A cloth laundry bag he'd been using to store dirty socks, 2 M1 Garand rifle slings taken from damaged weapons, a broken aluminum tent pole someone had discarded after their shelter collapsed, a spare canteen strap, and his own torn field jacket that he'd been meaning to replace but never had time. Reyes stared at these objects, ordinary, non-medical, useless according to every training manual, and his mind raced through the physics of hemorrhage control, through the principles he'd learned about pressure and compression and blood flow, and suddenly he saw the solution that existed in the space between standard procedure and desperate innovation. He could build a compression device, a distributed pressure system that would work like a tourniquet but better, using the tent pole as a windlass, the laundry bag as a broad pressure pad that wouldn't crush bone, and the rifle slings as stabilizing harnesses that would prevent the whole assembly from sliding. It was insane, it had never been done, no manual described it, but Reyes knew the theory was sound. If he could create enough pressure distributed across a wide enough area, if he could lock that pressure in place with a windlass mechanism, if he could stabilize the whole thing against Collins's thrashing, then maybe, just maybe, he could stop the arterial bleed without crushing the femoral nerve or causing compartment syndrome or doing any of the dozen things that could turn a saved life into a saved but crippled life. His hands moved with the frantic precision of someone who knows that speed matters as much as accuracy. He grabbed the laundry bag, dumped out the dirty socks, and began stuffing it with anything soft he could find. Gauze pads, torn pieces of his field jacket, rags from other soldiers' packs, creating a cushioned compression pad about 6 inches wide and 3 inches thick, broad enough to distribute pressure across the thigh without focusing all the force on a single point that might crush bone or nerve. He positioned this improvised pad directly over the wound site, pressing down hard while Collins screamed and tried to push him away, and Reyes had to use his body weight to keep the soldier pinned while he worked, had to ignore the screaming and the blood soaking through his sleeves and the German machine gun fire that was still searching for targets. He threaded the rifle slings around Collins's thigh in a cross pattern, creating a 4-point.